Niagara Falls was waking to the soft glow of the early morning sun, the mist from its roaring cascades casting a shimmering veil over the cliffs. The iconic site, often described as one of the most romantic places in the world, held a deep serenity at this hour. Tourists began to trickle in, eager to catch a glimpse of the natural wonder before the crowds arrived. Among the early risers was a park ranger on his morning patrol. His task was routine: ensure safety, check for any signs of damage, and maintain the park's pristine condition. Yet, as he walked along a trail skirting the edge of the falls, a dark shape against the rocks below drew his attention. At first glance, it seemed to be debris carried by the river's relentless current. But as he focused, the truth became chillingly clear. It was a human body, crumpled against the jagged rocks. The ranger immediately radioed for assistance. Within minutes, the tranquil morning was disrupted by the wail of sirens and the arrival of first responders. The body, later identified as that of Odessa Langford, was retrieved with care. She was young, her features eerily peaceful despite the bruises on her arms and the tear in her vibrant red dress. Her limbs lay twisted unnaturally, and her feet were bare. Her presence in such a perilous place raised more questions than answers. By the time investigators from the Niagara Regional Police Service arrived, the area had been cordoned off. Tourists were redirected, their curiosity met with polite but firm explanations. Detective Maria Lawson, a veteran officer known for her methodical approach, observed the scene with a practiced eye. The victim's identity had already been established through a driver's license found tucked in her pocket. Odessa Langford, a 29-year-old woman from Burlington, Vermont, had checked into the nearby Grand Niagara Hotel just days earlier on what was supposed to be her honeymoon. The initial impression suggested a tragic accident. The falls had a history of such incidents, tourists venturing too close to the edge or misjudging the slippery rocks. However, certain details didn't fit the narrative. The bruises on Odessa's wrists hinted at a struggle, and the torn fabric of her dress suggested something far from accidental. There were no shoes found near her body, an anomaly given the steep terrain she would have traversed to reach the location. Detective Lawson's focus sharpened as the inconsistencies added up. She instructed her team to search the surrounding area for further evidence, while she turned her attention to the hotel. Every tragedy required context, and the people closest to the victim were often the key to understanding what had happened. At the Grand Niagara Hotel, staff and guests were beginning to notice the increased police presence. Whispers spread quickly, speculation fueled by the arrival of uniformed officers. Detective Lawson reviewed the hotel's guest list and found Odessa's name alongside that of her husband, Benedict Ashcroft. The couple had checked in 3 days prior. The front desk staff recalled them as quiet but polite, though one employee noted that Odessa had seemed tense during check-in. The investigation turned toward Benedict, whose location was confirmed as the hotel lobby. He sat hunched in a corner, his face pale and drawn. A half-empty cup of coffee sat on the table in front of him, untouched. Benedict, 34 years old and an urban planner from Minneapolis, was still dressed in the wrinkled remnants of what had once been formal attire. His disheveled state mirrored the growing weight of suspicion surrounding him. The early stages of an investigation were always chaotic, a whirlwind of theories and fragments of evidence. As the scene at the falls was processed and the husband's story awaited examination, Detective Lawson knew one thing with certainty. Odessa Langford's death was no ordinary tragedy. The serenity of Niagara Falls had been shattered, and beneath its beauty lay the beginning of a dark mystery. Odessa Langford had always been a person of quiet elegance. Born and raised in Burlington, Vermont, she had developed a passion for artisanal craftsmanship at a young age, eventually carving a niche as a chocolatier. Her work was a testament to her meticulous nature and creativity, blending precision with artistry. Her friends often described her as resilient, a quality honed through years of overcoming personal and professional challenges. Behind her serene demeanor, however, Odessa was known to keep her concerns private, preferring to confront difficulties internally rather than share them with others. Benedict "Ben" Ashcroft, on the other hand, was a man accustomed to structure and control. As an urban planner based in Minneapolis, Minnesota, Ben thrived in environments where order was paramount. His colleagues admired his ambition and discipline, though some quietly remarked on his tendency to micromanage. Beneath his professional polish, Ben harbored insecurities that he rarely disclosed. He often felt overshadowed by those who exuded natural confidence, a quality he both admired and envied in Odessa. Their paths crossed at a culinary exhibition in Chicago, where Odessa had been showcasing her award-winning truffles. Ben, attending the event with friends, was immediately captivated by her passion and precision. Their initial connection grew over shared conversations about craft and creativity, and within a few months they were inseparable. Their relationship was a whirlwind of shared experiences, from visiting artisanal markets to discussing their mutual love for detail-oriented work. Despite their compatibility, cracks began to surface as the relationship deepened. While Odessa's independence and quiet strength were traits that had initially drawn Ben to her, they later became sources of tension. Ben's need for affirmation and control occasionally clashed with Odessa's desire for autonomy. Friends noticed these dynamics but assumed they were minor hurdles in an otherwise strong bond. Their engagement came a year into their relationship, during a surprise proposal at a vineyard in Napa Valley. The proposal, captured in pictures later shared with their friends and family, appeared perfect. A sunset backdrop, Odessa's radiant smile, and Ben's proud embrace. Yet those closest to Odessa observed a subtle change in her demeanor in the weeks that followed. While she spoke warmly about Ben, there were moments when her usual confidence seemed overshadowed by hesitation. The wedding itself was a carefully orchestrated affair, blending Odessa's minimalist aesthetic with Ben's penchant for grand gestures. Set against the rolling hills of Vermont, the ceremony was picturesque, filled with heartfelt vows and an air of optimism. For those in attendance, the couple seemed destined for happiness. However, a few whispered among themselves about the absence of certain close friends of Odessa's, particularly those who had raised concerns about the speed and intensity of the relationship. The honeymoon at Niagara Falls was meant to be a fresh start, a break from the pressures of planning a wedding and the expectations of blending two lives into one. They checked into the Grand Niagara Hotel 3 days prior to the incident, choosing a suite with a panoramic view of the falls. Staff recalled them as courteous but distant from one another, with Odessa spending time reading near the lounge while Ben remained in the room or worked on his laptop. These small details, which seemed insignificant at the time, would later become pivotal in understanding the events leading to Odessa's death. The night before her body was found, hotel records showed the couple had dined at one of the hotel's fine dining restaurants. Witnesses described the atmosphere at their table as subdued. A waiter recalled that Odessa barely touched her meal, though she smiled politely when Ben spoke. The waiter also noted that Ben seemed distracted, frequently checking his phone. As the evening progressed, Odessa was seen walking alone through the lobby, carrying a small notebook she often used as a journal. A bartender at the hotel bar, Liam Parker, remembered her approaching him and asking for directions to a quiet walking path near the falls. She appeared calm but introspective, thanking him softly before heading toward the trail. Ben, meanwhile, had returned to their suite. By the time investigators began piecing together the timeline, a troubling narrative began to emerge. Odessa's journal, later discovered during a search of their belongings, revealed entries written in the days leading up to her death. In one passage, she reflected on feelings of unease, writing, "He says I'm too good for him, but sometimes it feels like he's holding me to a standard I don't understand. I'm trying to make this work, but I don't know how much more I can do." Ben's perspective on their relationship remained less clear. While he portrayed himself as a devoted husband trying to navigate newlywed challenges, his actions after Odessa's disappearance raised questions. He had waited hours before reporting her absence, a decision he attributed to a belief that she had needed space. Yet his agitation in the hotel bar, where he demanded to know if anyone had seen her, suggested a deeper anxiety about her whereabouts. The honeymoon that had promised to be the start of their new life together now stood as the backdrop for tragedy. Investigators faced the daunting task of unraveling a relationship that seemed perfect on the surface, but was clearly fraught with underlying tensions. Every detail, from Odessa's quiet moments of reflection to Ben's controlling tendencies, painted a picture of a union that may have been more fragile than anyone had realized. The suite at the Grand Niagara Hotel stood eerily silent as investigators began their examination. Its polished elegance, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering breathtaking views of the falls, seemed untouched at first glance. Yet beneath the pristine veneer, subtle signs hinted at a discordant reality. A faint smell of spilled wine lingered in the air, and a faint smear on the cream-colored carpet betrayed something far more sinister. Detective Maria Lawson took in the room with a practiced eye. her gaze settling on the details that most would overlook. A shattered compact mirror lay discarded near the bathroom doorway, its fragments glinting under the harsh light. On the desk, a notebook sat open, its blank pages untouched but for faint indentations from previous writings. The bed, though neatly made, bore a disheveled pillow and a small dark stain barely visible on the edge of the pristine white sheets. The first responders had already reported that Odessa's shoes were missing, a detail that struck Lawson as peculiar. The absence of such a basic item suggested either a hurried departure or someone deliberately staging the scene. The suite's balcony, with its view overlooking the falls, became another point of interest. The sliding glass door was slightly ajar, the morning breeze swaying the heavy drapes. A faint smudge, possibly a partial handprint, marred the otherwise spotless glass, as though someone had leaned against it. Among the items collected from the room, one stood out, a torn piece of paper found partially hidden beneath the bed. It appeared to be a page from Odessa's journal, the edges frayed as if it had been hastily ripped out. Written in her careful, looping handwriting, the fragment read, "I don't know how much longer I can keep this up. I'm trying, but it feels like I'm losing myself." Lawson folded the paper carefully, its weight heavy with implication. As the forensics team continued their work, attention turned to the trail leading to the falls. It was there, along the rocky pathway where Odessa's body had been discovered, that new clues emerged. A single pearl earring lay half buried in the dirt, its clasp broken. Nearby, the soil was disturbed, indicating a struggle. A broken branch jutted awkwardly from the brush, its jagged end suggesting it had been snapped with force. Lawson noted the placement of the earring, far from any logical path Odessa would have taken. Its position hinted not at an accident, but at something deliberate. The trail of evidence led investigators to the edge of the observation deck, where tourists often stood to marvel at the natural wonder. Here, the railing stood solid and intact, suggesting that Odessa had not simply fallen due to carelessness or misjudgment. Instead, the scene painted a picture of an encounter that had escalated beyond control. One of the park rangers assisting with the search added a detail that deepened the mystery. Along the lower rocks near the base of the falls, a crumpled receipt had been recovered, its ink blurred by water but still partially legible. It was from a local convenience store, time-stamped the evening before Odessa's death. The item purchased, a prepaid phone card. Lawson found this detail particularly intriguing. If Odessa had acquired a secondary phone, it raised questions about whom she might have been trying to contact. Back at the hotel, a search of the couple's belongings revealed no such phone, leading investigators to suspect that it had either been lost or taken. This seemingly minor detail began to take on greater significance as the investigation progressed. Odessa's recent journal entries had described a growing sense of isolation and unease in her marriage. If she had felt the need for secrecy, it was possible that this prepaid phone was her lifeline, a way to reach out without Ben's knowledge. The evidence began to point toward a story of tension and unraveling trust, but it was still incomplete. Forensic analysis of the suite confirmed traces of a substance on the broken compact mirror, later identified as a sedative. This revelation added a new layer of complexity. The substance was consistent with a prescription medication used to induce calm or sleep. Had Odessa taken it willingly, or had someone administered it without her knowledge? And if so, for what purpose? As the day progressed, Lawson's team shifted focus to witness accounts. Staff at the hotel were questioned extensively, and their observations added more layers to the already tangled web. Liam Parker, the bartender who had interacted with Odessa the previous evening, recalled her demeanor as composed but distant. She had asked him for directions to a quiet walking trail, a detail that now seemed significant given where her body was discovered. Parker also remembered seeing Ben later that night, pacing near the bar and demanding to know if anyone had seen Odessa. His behavior, described as agitated and erratic, raised questions about the timeline he had provided. Why had he waited so long before seeking help? And why had he approached the bar rather than immediately informing hotel security? These inconsistencies began to cast doubt on his account of events. As Lawson reviewed the initial findings, a troubling picture began to emerge. The journal entries, the missing phone, the traces of sedatives, and the evidence of a struggle all pointed to a dynamic far more complex than a simple accident or misstep. Odessa Langford's death was no longer a question of how but why, and the answer seemed to lie within the cracks of her seemingly perfect life. Lawson paused, reflecting on the cascading sequence of events. Niagara Falls, with its majestic beauty, now stood as the silent witness to a tragedy that was anything but serene. The investigation had only just begun, and the weight of unanswered questions loomed heavily. Each new clue hinted at a deeper truth, one that threatened to upend everything the couple's outward appearance had suggested. Odessa's story was no longer just about her final moments. It was about everything that had led her there, every choice, every relationship, and every silent plea for understanding that had gone unheard. For Detective Lawson, the path to justice was clear: piece together the fragments of Odessa's life and uncover the truth, no matter where it led. The stillness of Niagara Falls had been shattered by the unfolding tragedy, and now the investigation shifted from recovering evidence to piecing together a timeline. Detective Maria Lawson, meticulous and unflinching, began unraveling the final hours of Odessa Langford's life. The clues, scattered like fragments of glass, were slowly forming a narrative, but it remained far from complete. The Grand Niagara Hotel became the epicenter of the inquiry. Officers scoured every corner of the couple's suite, common areas, and surrounding trails. Each interaction Odessa had on the night of her death was scrutinized, every seemingly inconsequential detail now a potential lead. Meanwhile, Benedict Ashcroft remained at the hotel under close watch, his movements limited to the premises. Staff testimonies began to illuminate the tension that underpinned the couple's stay. Housekeeping staff noted that the suite had appeared unusually tidy in the days leading up to the incident, but the bed had often been left untouched, suggesting one of them might have been sleeping elsewhere. A concierge recalled Odessa asking for a map of local hiking trails on the morning before her death, adding that she seemed distracted, like she had a lot on her mind. Liam Parker, the bartender who had interacted with Odessa, provided crucial context. He remembered her walking into the bar shortly after 10:30 p.m., carrying a small notebook and ordering a glass of water. She had seemed composed but reserved, thanking him quietly when he gave her directions to a nearby walking trail that led toward the falls. Parker had assumed she needed time to herself, as many guests did after a long day of sightseeing. What struck him most was how her calm demeanor contrasted sharply with that of her husband, who appeared an hour later, pacing and demanding to know if anyone had seen her. The disparity in their behavior raised red flags. Odessa had sought solitude, but Ben's agitation suggested a growing unease about her absence. Why had he waited to act? Why approach the bar instead of alerting security? These questions nagged at Lawson as she reviewed the testimonies. Hotel surveillance footage offered further clarity. Odessa was seen exiting the elevator at approximately 11:30 p.m., dressed casually and clutching her notebook. Her steps were deliberate, not hurried, as she made her way through the lobby and out the main entrance. 20 minutes later, Ben followed, his posture stiff, his movements brisk. He walked in the opposite direction of Odessa's path, heading toward the parking lot before circling back to the hotel. This sequence contradicted his earlier statement that he had stayed in the suite after their argument. Meanwhile, Odessa's belongings revealed more unsettling details. Her journal, recovered from her suitcase, contained a series of entries that painted a vivid picture of her state of mind. In one entry dated 2 days before her death, she had written, "I feel like I'm walking on a tightrope. He keeps saying he loves me, but sometimes it feels like I'm suffocating. I need space, but I don't know how to ask for it without hurting him." The torn page found under the bed added an ominous layer to her thoughts. It was shorter, less composed, almost as if written in haste. "I can't keep pretending everything is okay. I thought I could fix this, but maybe it's too late." The discovery of these entries shifted the investigation's focus from the physical evidence to the psychological dynamics of the couple's relationship. Forensic results from the suite added yet another piece to the puzzle. The traces of sedatives found on the broken compact mirror suggested that someone had access to medication that could induce drowsiness or relaxation. This detail raised the stakes. Was Odessa attempting to calm herself? Or had Ben used the substance as part of a more sinister plan? The compact mirror bore only Ben's fingerprints, further implicating him in the events leading up to her death. Lawson's team expanded their inquiries to include interviews with hotel guests who had rooms near the couple's suite. A guest on the same floor reported hearing muffled voices and the sound of something heavy falling late in the evening. While the sounds were not distinct enough to discern specific words, the timing aligned with Odessa's departure from the suite. Another guest, traveling with her teenage daughter, recalled seeing a figure resembling Ben near the hotel's rear exit around midnight. These details, while circumstantial, added weight to the suspicion building around Ben. Back at the observation deck near the falls, officers meticulously combed the area for additional clues. The earring found along the trail was confirmed to belong to Odessa, its clasp bent as if it had been yanked or fallen during a struggle. Soil samples taken from the disturbed area matched the dirt found on Ben's shoes, contradicting his claim that he had not followed her to the falls. As Lawson reviewed the mounting evidence, she couldn't ignore the timeline's inconsistencies. Ben's account had changed several times, and while he maintained his innocence, the physical and circumstantial evidence increasingly pointed to his involvement. His emotional state during questioning was another factor. His tears and tremors seemed genuine, yet there was a distinct lack of clarity in his responses. It was as though he wanted to say more, but couldn't bring himself to do so. By the day's end, the case had taken on a troubling shape. Odessa Langford's death was no longer just a tragic fall, but the result of a sequence of events marked by tension, secrecy, and possibly premeditation. Her journal entries, the missing phone, the sedatives, and the forensic evidence all hinted at a relationship that had been unraveling long before they arrived at Niagara Falls. Lawson knew the road ahead would be arduous. Every answer seemed to spawn new questions, and while the evidence increasingly pointed to Ben, the full truth remained elusive. As the investigation deepened, one thing became clear. Behind the image of a perfect honeymoon lay a story of fear, control, and a desperate search for freedom. As the investigation into Odessa Langford's death progressed, the seemingly idyllic setting of Niagara Falls gave way to an undercurrent of secrets and despair. Detective Maria Lawson meticulously pieced together fragments of Odessa's life from the evidence, each discovery revealing a story more complex than anticipated. Clues began to paint a picture not only of Odessa's final hours, but also of the emotional dynamics that had brought her to this tragic end. The torn journal pages found in Odessa's belongings became a focal point for understanding her mindset in the days leading up to her death. Her words, at times cryptic and fragmented, spoke of inner turmoil. One entry stood out. "I thought this trip would bring us closer, but I feel more distant than ever. I love him, but I'm scared of what happens when he loses control." Lawson pored over these lines, trying to make sense of the relationship they described. Was this fear of Ben grounded in physical danger, or had Odessa been grappling with an emotional toll that had simply grown too heavy to bear? The journal hinted at her growing isolation, a need for space, and a desire to find solace away from her husband. The missing prepaid phone she had purchased further emphasized the secrecy Odessa had felt was necessary. Lawson wondered who Odessa had intended to call that night and why. Meanwhile, forensic evidence from the suite added another layer of intrigue. The compact mirror coated with sedative residue was examined further, confirming that it had been tampered with. Experts determined that the amount of sedative present was enough to cause significant drowsiness, leading investigators to question whether it had been administered with Odessa's knowledge. The mirror, bearing only Ben's fingerprints, placed him squarely in the spotlight. Surveillance footage captured another key detail. Odessa was seen leaving the hotel lobby at 11:30 p.m., walking toward the trail she had asked about earlier in the evening. Her steps were measured, not hurried, as though she were seeking clarity in the stillness of the night. 20 minutes later, Ben was seen exiting the hotel as well. Unlike Odessa, his movements were erratic. He walked briefly toward the parking lot before returning to the main path that led to the falls. These discrepancies raised critical questions about his intent and whether he had been tracking her movements. The trail near the observation deck yielded more physical clues. The single earring found on the ground, its clasp bent as if torn during a struggle, was matched to Odessa's belongings. The disturbed soil, broken branch, and scattered leaves indicated a physical altercation had taken place. Soil samples from Ben's shoes matched the composition of the dirt from the scene, placing him at the exact location where the struggle had occurred. As Lawson reviewed the trail of evidence, she couldn't ignore the receipt found near Odessa's body. Though crumpled and waterlogged, it provided a critical detail. The timestamp indicated that Odessa had purchased a prepaid phone card earlier that evening. This discovery, combined with her missing phone, suggested she had been planning to make contact with someone privately. When investigators delved into her recent activity, they uncovered a connection that added a startling twist to the case. A call had been made from Odessa's missing phone earlier that week to Callum Hart, a glassblower from Providence, Rhode Island, who had once been her mentor. When contacted by investigators, Callum confirmed he had spoken with Odessa before her honeymoon. Their conversation, he said, had been about her growing doubts regarding her marriage. He recalled Odessa describing Ben as increasingly distant and controlling, but he emphasized that Odessa hadn't expressed fear for her safety, only her uncertainty about their future together. Callum's testimony was damning not because it implicated him, but because it further reinforced the image of a deteriorating relationship. The prepaid phone, coupled with her journal entries, suggested that Odessa may have been planning an escape. Was she seeking support from Callum, or had she confided in someone else about her fears? The investigation had yet to answer these questions, but the picture of her mental state became clearer. Odessa had been desperately seeking freedom from an emotionally suffocating bond. Ben's version of events grew increasingly shaky under scrutiny. Initially, he claimed to have stayed in the suite after Odessa left for her walk, yet forensic evidence and witness statements contradicted this timeline. A guest staying near the couple's suite reported hearing muffled shouting around 11:45 p.m., followed by a loud thud. Another guest recalled seeing Ben near the rear exit of the hotel shortly after midnight, his expression tense and his clothing disheveled. These accounts, combined with the surveillance footage, painted a starkly different picture from the one Ben had offered. By now, Lawson and her team were building a case that hinged on both the physical evidence and the psychological dynamics between Odessa and Ben. Each clue suggested a relationship fraught with tension, one where resentment and control had slowly eclipsed affection. The sedative-laced compact mirror, the torn journal pages, the missing phone, and the evidence of a struggle near the falls all pointed toward an act of desperation or violence. As the pieces began to align, one fact loomed unavoidably. Ben's story was unraveling. His behavior, both leading up to and following Odessa's death, suggested not a grieving husband but a man caught in a web of lies. Lawson knew the road ahead would require careful navigation. While the evidence against Ben was mounting, the lack of a direct confession meant that every piece had to be scrutinized and corroborated. Odessa's death had shaken the serene facade of Niagara Falls, turning its tranquil beauty into the backdrop of a chilling mystery. With each discovery, the investigation grew more complex, and the weight of unraveling the truth became ever heavier. For Detective Lawson, justice for Odessa meant not only uncovering what had happened that night, but also understanding the deep emotional fractures that had led to such a tragic end. As the investigation progressed, the growing weight of evidence against Benedict Ashcroft began to align like pieces of a grim puzzle. Detective Maria Lawson, seasoned in navigating the complexities of human behavior, couldn't ignore the pattern emerging. This was no longer a question of if Ben had been involved in Odessa Langford's death. It was a matter of understanding why and how. Ben's demeanor during questioning had oscillated between confusion, defensiveness, and moments of carefully controlled emotion. Lawson had seen this behavior before. It was the hallmark of someone struggling to balance their version of events with the reality they couldn't fully erase. His tears seemed calculated, his pauses deliberate, as though measuring his words against the weight of what investigators might already know. Forensic evidence continued to chip away at his narrative. The soil samples recovered from Ben's shoes placed him unequivocally at the trail where Odessa's earring and signs of a struggle had been discovered. The broken branch, snapped under considerable force, suggested a physical altercation. Odessa's bruises, faint but distinct on her wrists, added weight to the theory that she had tried to resist in her final moments. Yet it wasn't just the physical evidence that painted Ben as the perpetrator. The psychological dynamics of their relationship were equally revealing. Odessa's journal entries depicted a husband whose insecurities had grown oppressive, a man who vacillated between declarations of love and fits of anger. "He wants everything to be perfect," one entry read, "but I can't be his perfect wife, I'm just trying to breathe." Lawson began to construct a timeline that tied Ben's emotional state to his actions. Witnesses at the hotel described him as agitated, pacing the lobby late into the night. Surveillance footage showed him leaving the suite shortly after Odessa, contradicting his earlier claim that he had remained inside. These details, while circumstantial, painted a picture of a man whose emotions had spiraled out of control. The sedative-laced compact mirror became another critical piece of evidence. Toxicology reports confirmed that traces of the substance had been found in Odessa's system. While not enough to incapacitate her fully, the presence of the drug suggested it had been used to impair her judgment or mobility. The mirror, bearing only Ben's fingerprints, indicated deliberate intent. As Lawson pieced together the events of that fateful night, a chilling narrative emerged. Odessa, seeking solitude after an argument, had left the suite with her journal and a prepaid phone. She had walked toward the trail, likely contemplating the steps she needed to take to regain her independence. Ben, driven by a mix of anger and desperation, had followed her, his thoughts clouded by insecurities and a need to reassert control. The struggle near the falls, evidenced by the disturbed soil and broken branch, marked the climax of their confrontation. Ben's strength, combined with the effects of the sedative, had left Odessa vulnerable. Whether her fall had been intentional or the result of a physical altercation remained unclear, but the evidence suggested Ben had done nothing to prevent it. Instead, he had staged the scene, returning to the suite to create an alibi and waiting until morning to report her missing. The emotional motive behind Ben's actions began to take shape. Interviews with colleagues and friends painted a portrait of a man who thrived on control. In his professional life, this had served him well. His career as an urban planner demanded precision and authority. In his personal life, however, this need for control had manifested as possessiveness and an inability to handle rejection. Odessa's growing independence and her quiet resistance to his expectations had likely fueled his insecurities. To Ben, the honeymoon had been more than a celebration of their union. It had been his opportunity to restore the dynamic he believed had been lost. When Odessa distanced herself emotionally, his fragile sense of self-worth had crumbled and his actions had turned desperate. The discovery of Odessa's prepaid phone, retrieved from a trash bin near the observation deck, provided the final link. Investigators recovered fragments of a text message draft addressed to Callum Hart. "I'm scared. I don't know what he'll do if..." The message had been left unsent, interrupted by events that would soon spiral out of control. This revelation not only confirmed Odessa's fears, but also underscored the psychological torment she had endured. With each piece of evidence, the case against Ben became more compelling. His attempts to deflect suspicion, his shifting narrative, and the growing body of physical and circumstantial evidence left little room for doubt. For Lawson, the challenge was no longer proving Ben's guilt. It was understanding the depths of his motivation and ensuring justice for Odessa. As the investigation neared its conclusion, Lawson prepared to confront Ben with the evidence. The picture she now held in her mind was not just of a crime, but of a relationship that had unraveled under the weight of control, insecurity, and unspoken fears. Odessa's death was not a random tragedy. It was the culmination of a dynamic that had been eroding for months, perhaps even years. Niagara Falls, with its majestic beauty, had borne witness to the final chapter of Odessa Langford's life. But the story it now told was one of heartbreak and the destructive power of unchecked emotions. For Ben Ashcroft, the walls were closing in, and the truth he had tried to bury was beginning to rise to the surface. The evidence against Benedict Ashcroft reached its breaking point as Detective Maria Lawson methodically presented her case. Ben's carefully crafted narrative, riddled with contradictions, had unraveled under the weight of forensic findings and psychological analysis. Yet one lingering question remained. Had Ben acted alone, or had someone else been complicit in Odessa Langford's tragic death? The answer came unexpectedly during a routine examination of Ben's digital activity. Investigators uncovered a series of encrypted messages exchanged between Ben and a previously unknown individual, later identified as Victor LaSalle, a former acquaintance of Ben's from his college years. Victor, known for his troubled history and involvement in minor criminal schemes, had been contacted by Ben weeks before the honeymoon. The messages revealed a chilling plan to handle a delicate situation, couched in vague but ominous terms. Victor was brought in for questioning, his demeanor guarded but visibly anxious. Under mounting pressure and the threat of being charged as an accessory to murder, he admitted to providing Ben with the sedative found in Odessa's system. He claimed he had believed it was meant to calm Ben's nerves during a marital dispute, but investigators found this explanation thin. Victor's involvement, while peripheral, had been instrumental in enabling Ben's actions. His decision to supply the substance tied him irrevocably to the crime. With Victor's testimony, the timeline of events leading to Odessa's death became clear. Ben had reached out to Victor, expressing his fears that Odessa was pulling away and threatening the life he had envisioned for them. While Victor insisted he had no knowledge of Ben's true intentions, the messages painted a damning picture of their collusion. Together, they had created the conditions that led to a night of irrevocable decisions. On the morning of the trial, the courtroom was packed with journalists, family members, and curious onlookers. The prosecution presented its case with unrelenting precision. They outlined Ben's controlling behavior, the sedative used to impair Odessa, and the evidence of a struggle near the falls. They emphasized the role of Victor LaSalle as an enabler, arguing that his actions had emboldened Ben and set the stage for the crime. When it came time for Ben to speak, he offered no grand defense. Instead, his words were halting and fragmented, as if the weight of his actions had finally broken through the layers of denial. He admitted to following Odessa to the trail that night, confronting her as she stood near the edge of the falls. His feelings of inadequacy and rejection had boiled over, leading to a moment of blind rage. He pushed her, he confessed, but claimed he hadn't intended for her to fall. The courtroom fell silent as the jury deliberated. Hours later, they returned with a verdict. Benedict Ashcroft was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Victor LaSalle, though spared the full weight of Ben's punishment, was convicted as an accessory and sentenced to 10 years. In the weeks that followed, the public's fascination with the case gave way to reflection. Odessa's family, devastated by her loss, established a foundation in her memory. Its mission was to raise awareness about emotional abuse and the warning signs of controlling relationships, offering support to those trapped in similar dynamics. For Detective Maria Lawson, the case served as a reminder of the profound complexity of human relationships. The tragedy had been born not out of premeditation, but out of an unchecked spiral of emotions fueled by insecurity and desperation. Lawson hoped that Odessa's story, though heartbreaking, would serve as a cautionary tale for others. Odessa Langford's death was a sobering reminder of the dangers of unspoken fears and unresolved conflicts. It highlighted the importance of recognizing toxic dynamics and seeking help before emotions spiral out of control. For Ben Ashcroft, his inability to confront his insecurities led to irreversible consequences, not just for Odessa, but for everyone connected to her. The case underscored the value of addressing mental health, fostering open communication, and recognizing the early signs of abusive behavior. It reminded everyone that true love is built on respect and equality, not control or dependency. As Niagara Falls returned to its serene beauty, its legacy was forever changed. Beneath its majestic waters lay the memory of a young woman whose life was cut short, a story that, though tragic, held the potential to inspire understanding and change. The story has been edited to ensure personal privacy and security regarding names and locations. Thanks for watching. If you liked the video, don't forget to subscribe to see the latest and most thrilling family crime stories.